this is the problem with calorie restriction long-term as well. So calories in, calories out fails for long-term weight loss because of this. You can't starve yourself forever. The way that people need to lose weight is by correcting metabolic dysfunction, not by creating long-term massive calorie deficits. The problem I have with the calories in, calories out hypothesis is that the quality of the calories you put in your body affect the calories out. I still think that there is a caloric deficit that leads to weight loss for people, but you cannot put yourself in a starvation prison for the rest of your life. Your body will downregulate your metabolism through this lever of the thyroid gland. And so this is not the answer. Weight Watchers fails over and over and over because it's not affecting the quality of food.
Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey.
What is up, you guys? I am so excited for another week of the podcast. And as you all know, I am so excited for Heart and Soil. This is my heart and soul. Imagine that. Maybe that's why I named it something like that. It's my passion project and it's doing amazing. And we're so excited that all of you are really appreciating what we're doing. But we are making desiccated organ supplements from grass-fed, grass-finished cattle in New Zealand, and we are developing a US-based supply chain. We're super proud of the uniqueness of our formulas. We've got a bone marrow and liver supplement, which is the only bone marrow containing desiccated organ supplement on the market right now that doesn't have flow agents. Our beef organs is basically the ultimate multivitamin with heart, liver, pancreas, spleen, and kidney. And we've got some really exciting things in the works. In the next few weeks, you'll see Firestarter, which is our high stearic acid tallow from suet supplement, our gut and digestion, which has tripe, intestines, liver, spleen, and pancreas. There's nothing like these on the market, and I'm so excited that they are helping you guys reclaim your ancestral birthright to radical health through this nose-to-tail nourishment. So you can check us out at heartandsoilsupplements.com. And if you are a listener of this podcast, you will know that this is something that I believe in very deeply. Nose-to-tail nutrition will be so critical in all of your lives and really improve the lives of so many that you know. My sister takes it, her kids take it, my niece and nephew are the apple of my eye, my parents are taking these, and it's so much easier a way to get this deep nutrition that our ancestors have always treasured back into our lives. So check us out, heartandsoilsupplements.com. We're also now on Amazon. You can just search Heart and Soil on Amazon and see that, see the bone marrow and liver and the beef organs, and the Firestarter, gut and digestion, and blood builder will be out within the next few weeks. So check that stuff out, you guys. I am so happy to be able to do it for you. I am so excited also about the guest this week, none other than Elle Russ. She is the author of the Paleo Thyroid Solution. Elle and I did an episode a while back that is one of the most popular episodes I've ever had on the podcast. That episode is titled How Broccoli is Destroying Your Thyroid. All of the podcasts and all of my videos are at the Heart and Soil Supplements website as well. If you need references to any of that stuff, there's a lot of good information there. And at the Heart and Soil website, all the supplements that we make have lots of scientific information and lots of research that we did regarding the ancestral use as well. So Elle and I, on this episode, went even deeper into thyroid. The first episode, we talked about her journey. We talked about the things that could impair your thyroid function. And in this episode, we went even deeper. We talked about how to evaluate your thyroid, what labs to get, what happened to Elle's thyroid, how it got broken in the first place probably, and how to fix it. This is the two episodes that I've done with Elle Russ are now really an A to Z guide in terms of how to rehabilitate your thyroid. And it starts with good nutrition. It starts, in my opinion, with animal-based nose-to-tail nutrition and elimination of toxins. And in the show notes, which are, of course, at the Heart and Soil website, you will find links to any of the articles we have in this video. There's an audio there. There's a video version there if you want to see the actual studies as we are reviewing them when we are doing the podcast. So super excited to feature this one with Elle. Listen to the first episode if you need more background, but if you have thyroid issues or you know anyone who has thyroid issues, these two podcasts will be such a valuable gem for you. I know it. And as we talk about on this podcast, so many things are related to the thyroid and we just aren't even aware of it. It's connected with everything. And in order to properly evaluate it, we have to realize that everything is connected. I'm so thankful to all of you for leaving reviews for the podcast as well. If you appreciate this podcast, My ask is that you go to iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast and leave me a review. It helps me grow, and it's how more people listen to the podcast. So thank you for your reviews. Thank you also to my sponsors. I've been really excited about Let's Get Checked. This is a new sponsor to the podcast this month, but it is so important for us all to get our blood work. And here's a statistic for you, that across the globe, men's healthy sperm counts have dropped 50% in the last 40 years. Hormonal imbalances, reduced testosterone levels are commonplace in modern male health. If you've heard me talk about the blue zones, you know that in Loma Linda, the sperm counts are very low there. Most people who listen to this podcast are more savvy than those guys, and they're eating animal foods, but 1 in 4 men over 30 have low testosterone and have a hormonal imbalance, and symptoms can be low energy or fatigue, erectile dysfunction, low sex drive, anxiety, brain fog, decision-making. It's not a good thing. And this can even happen for women too. As you'll hear in this podcast, testosterone is important for women. So Let's Get Checked is awesome because they are allowing us to get blood work done at home. It's fast, affordable, confidential. They do male hormone test kits and a lot of other things. So you can take a measured approach to your health and measure these hormones in the comfort of your home. Because you are listening to my podcast, Let's Get Checked is offering 20% off by using this URL code, trylgc.com/CarnivoreMD. So here's how it works. You go to trylgc.com/CarnivoreMD, choose your test online. It's delivered to you in discreet packaging, next day delivery, activate your test, collect your sample at home, and then send it back to the lab. Once the sample arrives, you'll get results at a secure online account in 2 to 5 days, and you can do testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, prolactin, estrogen, free androgen index, and they will be reviewed by a physician and a nurse, and the nurse will contact you for an over-the-phone consultation included with the test. So Let's Get Checked is a CLIA-approved laboratory. It's an actual legit lab. It's the highest ranking level of accreditation. All the data is completely anonymized to make sure your privacy is maintained. And it's going to let you know what is going on the inside so you can take a scientific approach to improving your life, which is what I'm all about. And I've tested my blood work with them. I tested my testosterone with Let's Get Checked. I tested my homocysteine and my CRP and my blood lipids. So you can even get your linoleic acid levels checked and your omega-3 levels checked with LGC. So the code is trylgc.com/CarnivoreMD. That is trylgc.com/CarnivoreMD for 20% off. Do it. Getting tested is responsible, and it helps us empowered. It empowers us to take just control of our health. That's what I'm all about. You got to live well. Your family wants to live well, and it's really cool to get blood work done in such a convenient way. So check these guys out. I appreciate them at Let's Get Checked greatly. You guys also know that I always appreciate White Oak Pastures, whiteoakpastures.com. They are the 6th generation family farm in Bluffton, Georgia. I'm going to be going there very soon to see them and hang out. Unfortunately, we are going to have to push White Oak Cella to next year because of the whole coronavirus stuff, but I'm going to be there in the near future, hanging out at the farm and working on some fun projects with them. But Jenny and Will Harris, who run the farm, are amazing individuals. They are beautiful souls. And that farm has been regenerative for over 20 years. If you've read my book, The Carnivore Code, if you've read the things I've talked about, they are really leading the way in terms of this amazing type of regenerative agriculture that puts carbon back into the soil. You can see on their website, you can see with the life cycle analysis that they are carbon negative. How cool is this, you guys? This is the way we should be raising animals. This is the future of our planet. The soil carbon index is what determines whether we can continue to raise plants and animals and be sustainably living on this planet. So supporting this type of agriculture is so important. You can use the code CarnivoreMD for 10% off your first order at White Oak Pastures. Let them know I sent you. You will love this meat, guys. If you don't, I don't know what to think, because this is basically the most delicious meat I've ever had. They have organs, they have suet, they have liver. If you're lucky, they'll have thymus or other organs that you want to get. Again, if you can't get fresh organs, check us out at Heart and Soil for desiccated organs. But I'm super excited about you guys eating organs in one form or another. But White Oak is the place to do it. Support these people. They are doing good work in this world. I also want to give a shout out to Nutrisense.io. Really appreciate what these guys are doing. You can listen to the CGM episode, the continuous glucose monitor episode I did with them, and learn all about the things I have discovered wearing a CGM. I am, in fact, wearing a new CGM from them right now. I put it on yesterday, I calibrated it, and I looked at my breakfast this morning and I thought, that's cool. With some carbohydrates, with probably about 60 grams of carbohydrates, my blood sugar only rose to 104. How cool is that? Carbohydrates don't cause diabetes. You guys know this if you've been listening to me. But the postprandial response to food is perhaps one of the best metrics of overall metabolic health. And if you've listened to the continuous glucose monitor podcast, you know that, you know how to interpret these, but you can't lie with this. That's why CGMs are so valuable. I can't wait for my dad to wear his, and I know that it is a powerful tool for behavioral change. So do not sleep on the continuous glucose monitors. Go over there to nutrisense.io and get one for your family. It's direct to consumer. You don't need a prescription. And if you email me at drpaul, drpaul@heartandsoilsupplements.com. I'm always happy to answer questions about this stuff there. And then I want to give a shout out to my friends at forceofnaturmeats.com. Force of Nature is good people doing good things with regenerative agriculture. They're doing bison. They have a organ grind. They have ground beef. They have ancestral. They have elk. They have pork. And they have steaks and medallions of venison, and it is good stuff. And they are doing it right. This is regenerative agriculture done right, you guys. Check them out. forceofnature.com. forceofnature.com. I appreciate them so much as well. All right, you guys, on to the podcast. As I said a couple of times, if you have questions for me, shoot me an email, Dr. Paul, drpaul@heartandsoilsupplements.com. Obviously, that's our website, www.heartandsoilsupplements.com. I will answer your questions, but we have a lot of resources on the website. We have all my podcasts, all my videos, blog posts. It is a veritable repository of good information, and we are moving the needle and helping more people reclaim their ancestral birthright to radical health. On to the podcast. Listen after for what is going on with me. All right, Elle Russ, thanks for coming back on the podcast. Good to have you here.
Oh, so happy to be here and talk more about this topic.
Talk more about thyroid stuff. So everyone listening, you guys, Elle and I did a previous podcast that you may want to check out. That is found, you can find that at the heartandsoilsupplements.com website. On the podcast page, you can just search Elle Russ and you'll find it. It's entitled How Broccoli is Destroying Your Thyroid. And we will get into some of that today as well. Elle, can you allow me to screen share, which is under, you go into the share screen option on Zoom, and I will screen share that picture for people. Cool.
And what do I do? Multiple participants, advanced sharing options, or which one? Advanced sharing options?
I think you go to advanced sharing options and you enable
all participants
can share.
Okay. Did that work?
Let's see. Cool. That worked. So you guys all know this is both video and audio recorded. So this is what it looks like at the Heart and Soil website. You guys, you can just search the name of the person you're looking for here. Here is the previous podcast I did with Elle if you guys want to reference that. But we are going to dig further into the thyroid rabbit hole today. But let's just start with a quick recap of your story and bring people up to speed, Elle, and then we'll get deep into the weeds.
Yeah. So the quick story is that I suffered for years and went to over two dozen endocrinologists and doctors and celebrity hormone doctors in LA, and no one would help me. And they were all testing me wrong and no one knew what was wrong with me. And I was having all sorts of issues. And then finally I was like, okay, these people aren't helping me. And the only people that did really were fellow thyroid patients online in a forum who kind of gave me a little bit of a roadmap to start to go down the rabbit hole so that I could help myself. So what happened was I ended up having to be my own doctor. Really annoying. I had to be my own doctor. I had to go get my own thyroid hormones on the black market on the web and dose myself and use doctors for blood work and then not listen to them. Long story short, I solved 2 severe bouts of hypothyroidism in 1 decade. And the second one was a serious reverse T3 problem, which are more on the rise now. I see more people with reverse T3 issues than anywhere else. And that is a topic that most doctors really don't know about. So 99% of the doctors out there, I can't make that exact, but too many are uninformed and steeped in these outdated 1973 protocols for thyroid health because that's what they learn in medical school. And so that is why patients are suffering. The big message there is if you got a disease you got diagnosed with, you better look into it. You cannot put your health in the hands of a doctor, whether they have a Yale or Harvard MD. I don't care. I've seen some of the dumbest moves I've ever seen have been made by Harvard, Ivy League educated doctors. So again, we as patients need to get out of this just please save me. I don't want to know. Just tell me. Okay. And then on the other side, doctors need to get more informed. They're really outdated. And so this happened to me just the other day. This happens to me every day with people calling me from all over the world. But I was on a hike. Someone brought their friend. She is postmenopausal and has a lot of weight around the middle. And she mentioned she had Hashimoto's. And my friend knows a lot like I do about it. And we look at each other and I said, okay, here we go. I said, what do they test? She said, oh, I think they test the free T3. No, they test all that stuff. And I said, I'm not buying it, because oftentimes when a patient says that, it turns out not to be true. So go home and you text me and you let me know. Now, she has been on thyroid medication for 30 years. They've only tested her TSH the whole time. So I said, okay, I know there's a problem here. She's been on Levoxyl T4 only for, all these years. They only test the TSH. And she's suffering. She's suffering, but it's a new normal. As you know, Paul, when you talk to people, you get to feel a certain amount of crappy, low-level malaise, and you become used to it, where you forget that you could feel better, or you chalk it up to like, well, I'm getting old. This happens. No. So anyway, she gets back to me with the tests. Sure enough, not only is her free T3 suboptimal for being on her treatment, the TSH looked good. The free T4 looked good, but this is why it's not the full picture. Reverse T3 in the range of 0 to 25 was 22. Her ratio between the free T3 and the reverse T3 was 13. 20 and higher is usually best. So she's screwed. And so that's the day when a patient goes, I just spent 10, 20 years of my life living like this because my doctor didn't know what they're doing. And so this is why you got to learn this stuff. Everyone's got to learn it.
And yeah, so let's just break this down for people, because already after the last podcast, a bunch of people said, wow, Paul, you found someone that speaks faster than you, which is amazing.
I'll speak slower if you want.
No, you're great. But the zeal is amazing. But let's just break this down for people so they understand what we're talking about here.
Sure.
I'll screen share and we can both kind of walk people through how this all works in terms of thyroid hormone signaling. But the take-home message here is that the importance of the thyroid gland and proper thyroid function cannot be overstated. We'll get to this later in the podcast. If you guys listen to the first podcast that Elle and I did, we talked about things that can impair thyroid function. We'll hear a little bit more about Elle's story in a bit, about things that might have impaired her function, the functioning of her thyroid in the past. But the take-home here is that a lot of doctors are not going to diagnose this properly. They're not going to get really in the weeds and do all these metrics. Most people are just going to get a TSH, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone level. And the reason that is problematic is, we'll show here in the diagram. So in our brain, we have a region in the brain called the hypothalamus. It releases a compound called TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. That goes to the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, which is kind of that little stalk in the brain, a little gland that has a blood network associated with it. And from the pituitary comes TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes to the thyroid gland, which is in your neck around basically the trachea. And you may have all seen pictures of people. If you have not, we will show those in a little bit, of sort of the swollen thyroid gland when people have issues, whether it's an autoimmune issue that's causing the thyroid to be inflamed, or an absence of adequate iodine, which causes the thyroid to get hypertrophic as well. Now, the thyroid gland is an interesting gland. It makes this predominantly T4, which is then converted to T3 in the peripheral circulation, or that T4 can be converted to reverse T3. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Is Elle mentioned this ratio between T3 and reverse T3 is important. And the problem is that reverse T3 blocks cellular binding sites for this hormone. So T3 is triiodothyronine. T4 is generally known as thyroxine. And there are a lot of medication names we may throw out later so you guys will understand these, but the medications may be purely T4, levothyroxine. They may be a combination of T4 and T3, or they may be pure T3 like liothyronine. And the reason that's important is because T4 and T3 serve different roles in the body, and essentially T3 is the active form, broadly speaking. But that's kind of the rundown of that. Anything you would add to that, Elle?
Yeah, I do. So the thyroid gland doesn't just release T4, but mostly. Okay, so it does release a little bit of T3, which is why it's not complete endocrine mimicry to give someone T4 only. The other thing too is that reverse T3 is a natural process, and this is what we want to get across. So T4 is the storage hormone, right? It builds up, and then when it's needed, it's going to convert into T3. But when it doesn't, or there's a threat, or there's an issue happening, let's say you just like get run over by a car and you've got 15 broken limbs, in those environments, it might dial it back to avoid you from being hypermetabolic or putting more fire onto an inflammatory situation. So it's a natural process. It's not bad, because whatever T4 is not used in your body and converted, it'll just be flushed out through the reverse T3 problem. The problem is when it over converts into reverse T3. So I hope that cleared that up. And the way I like to describe it, and some people be like, this isn't science, it's a metaphor for people who aren't doctors to understand this, which is you can kind of see a reverse T3 problem like a guard standing in front of your cell, not allowing any of the T3 you're taking or your thyroid's making to kind of get in and do its job. It's like driving around the office building and never punching into work. You're not going to get paid. So we really want the package, which is T3. And reverse T3 problems are on the rise, meaning natural reverse T3 problems. I'm not just talking about people who ingest thyroid hormones. I'm talking about normal people. Stress. Stress is such a huge part of this. Heavy metals, right? Lack of selenium. There's so many things that contribute to what is, and then there could be the two D1 and D2, perhaps genetic. There's a couple enzymes involved in the conversion of T4 to T3, and there are people that have been known to not ever be able to tolerate T4, meaning they can't convert it. And so what happens is that you remain hypothyroid if your doctor's not looking at the reverse T3. So here's the thing, Paul. When I had a reverse T3 problem and I explained this to an uninformed doctor, and I was trying to explain all of this, he said, well, we just need to give you more armor, meaning more T4 and T3. And I said, you don't understand. If you keep giving me T4, you're going to make the problem worse. I'm going to get more and more hypothyroid. So that's why if you don't test it, for example, the TSH could look great. The free T4 could look great. And so could the free T3. But then the person's like, I'm still not doing great. That's when you look at the reverse T3. Well, you should always rule it out, but that's usually where the problem lies. And so to not test reverse T3 is borderline malpractice. I just can't even get it. That just makes me crazy that no one would do this. The other thing too is that reverse T3 is just a general marker of wellness and unwellness in any human body. Every doctor should be taking a full thyroid panel on all of their patients, including reverse T3. So for example, I was speaking with a client in Hawaii and the doctor would not test his reverse T3. And I said, go back and beg them. And they did. And the doctor's response was, well, we only test that when you're in the ICU. Well, I mean, even if you don't know anything about reverse T3, like if you're in the ICU, you're hating it. You're like really in a bad shape. So if you're testing it there because it's important there, why don't we test it before we get to the ICU? You know what I'm saying? So this is just really tough because I had another doctor who told me when I asked them to test a patient's reverse T3, they said, that's old school. We don't do that. And I said, well, it's really interesting you said that because I overcame a reverse T3 problem. And so I consider it kind of new school. And she said, fine, I'll test it, but I don't know how to evaluate it. And that's when I said, did you just patronize me about asking you about a test that now you're telling me you don't even know what it is? So this is what we come across.
That never happens in West. That never happens.
Right. It's this
so common.
It's this, we have to push them. And, people are intimidated by doctors. And it's like, you just have to learn this stuff so that you can demand the proper test. The other thing that happens and the mistakes that a patient makes is they ask the doctors for all the right tests. Then they go to the lab and then they send me the results and there's like 4 missing. And that's because the doctor goes, whatever, I know what thyroid panel I'm wanting. They don't actually do it. So that's a patient mistake too. When you go to the lab, you need to make sure were all of the things you requested checked off. Who wants to go back in 2 weeks and get a needle in their vein? I don't, dude. I want to be one and done with that blood test, right? So this happens a lot, and it's really important that it's paid attention to because reverse T3 problems are on the rise. It just seems like more and more people are showing up with reverse T3 problems. Is that stress, lack of sleep, insulin resist? Of course, it's all of the things you and I talk about, but it needs to be assessed because if you keep going in the direction of giving a patient who's got a reverse T3 problem, T4 or T4 and T3, they're never going to get better. Now, you don't always need to go to T3 only. which is a fix for reverse T3. Sometimes you just need to lower the T4, add a little T3 in the morning, and then do T3 the rest of the day. Meanwhile, they're working on their selenium, they're working on all the detox, they're working on all the stuff, and then maybe they can go back to a T4, T3 combo that's more normal of a dosing pattern, if that makes any sense. So it's not, and that's the other thing too, is someone will see they have a reverse T3 issue and they'll immediately jump to T3 only. Sometimes you have to, but sometimes you can just lessen the T4, up the T3, get some underlying stuff worked out, and then maybe go back and see if it'll convert again. Now, that didn't happen with me. I've had a reverse T3. And so for the past 8 years, I've been on T3 only because every single time I've tried to get off thyroid hormone, the reverse T3 creeps up again. And I've done the heavy metal detox, like I've done this, I've done it all. Maybe there's a genetic anomaly there, who knows? Maybe someday it will resolve itself. But the only reason I'm able to live well is because T3 is saving my life, because T4 is the only thing that converts into reverse T3. That's why T3 only is a savior for me.
And that's a ton again. So let's back up. We'll sort of rehash that for people. Again, if you guys want to watch this online, you can watch these specific diagrams we're going to pull up. It'll make more sense, but there's a lot of acronyms here, a little bit of an alphabet soup, but I found a good diagram that I can show people here. So again, we have the hypothalamus, thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, coming from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. We get thyroid stimulating hormone. This is the one that is usually only checked. And the reason that's checked is because there is some of this negative feedback between T4, so thyroxine. There is feedback between T4 and the brain. And so the sort of simplified version in Western medicine is, hey, if your TSH isn't elevated, you have enough thyroid hormones circulating in your body. And as we know, that's not precise enough to measure. So the first thing to mention is that TSH and the levels of thyroid hormones in your body are going to be inversely related. And this is confusing for people, but it has to do with this negative feedback loop between thyroxine and the brain. And the idea is that if your TSH is high, traditionally we would think of hypothyroidism. The brain is saying, hey, I'm not sensing enough T4. Therefore, I'm going to push a little harder from the hypothalamus, from the pituitary to the thyroid gland to secrete, like you said, mostly T4, a little bit of T3. Now, again, this misses a lot of problems because you're missing this whole downstream arm having to do with conversion of T4 into T3 and potentially reverse T3.
Right, and I want to chime in and say that. So one of the other, like you said, just testing the TSH makes no sense because the signal can be sent to the thyroid, but then we need to test if the thyroid's doing its job. A, is it pumping out enough of the stuff? And then B, is it converting into the thing that matters? So there's a couple of steps that are completely missed when a doctor, is just testing the TSH.
Exactly. And so you can see here at the thyroid, TSH is there stimulating the thyroid gland. This diagram is interesting. It says in an average person, thyroid gland produces about 6 micrograms per day of T3, 100 micrograms per day of T4. So like we said, it's a small amount of T3, this triiodothyronine, and mostly T4. Peripherally, T4 gets converted to T3. And these are the Ds here, D1, D2, D3 are the deiodinases that Elle mentioned. And I'll show you guys how the deiodinases work. But as the diagram would suggest, as the nomenclature suggests, T4 has 4 iodines on the molecule. And I'll show a diagram of that in a moment. And T3 has 3 iodines. Reverse T3 also has 3 iodines on the molecule, but they're in different spaces. So this is a good diagram that shows you a little bit of that. Here's tyrosine, which is an amino acid. It's a precursor for many things in the body, including dopamine and other neurotransmitters, but it can be a precursor for thyroxine. This is T4, and you can see there are 4 iodines, which is why iodine is essential for the thyroid. And we don't make iodine, it's a mineral, and we can talk about things in plant foods that can prevent you from absorbing iodine. Then you have triiodothyronine, and at this position up here, one of the iodines is missing. And remember, T3 is considered to be the more active form. And then reverse T3 is, the iodine is missing from a completely different space. Now, if you see this on the diagram on YouTube, what you'll notice is that these molecules look very similar, but they do very different things. Many of you may have heard me talking about linoleic acid recently, or even conjugated linoleic acid. And this is very analogous to this. Those two molecules are both 18 carbon polyunsaturated fats, but they have double bonds in different places. And the carbons on those molecules are arranged differently. One is cis, one is trans. And those molecules do very different things in the human body. Here we have one single iodine atom in a different position on the molecule. This one, T3, it's missing from sort of the ring that is furthest from the amino group. On reverse T3, it's missing from the benzene, this aromatic ring that is closer to the amino group. And therein lies this real subtle nuance. And this reverse T3, as we've been saying, is essentially shutting things off. It's putting the brakes on if you're in the ICU, if you have trauma, if you have sepsis, or if you're starving. And so very interesting to note the way these all look differently and how that affects our physiology. But if we go to just a diagram of thyroid hormone synthesis, hopefully this helps people understand. Iodine circulates in your blood. It is taken up by these thyroid follicular epithelial cells and really is moving across those follicular epithelial cells into the essentially a different part of the thyroid gland, where it is combined with thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin. If people have Hashimoto's, Elle mentioned Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition in which there are antibodies to a few things in the thyroid. One of them is thyroglobulin. So if you generate antibodies to thyroglobulin, sometimes we think of that, is that an autoimmune thyroiditis? Is that Hashimoto's? And you see these iodines combine on thyroglobulin. They make monoiodotyrosine, diiodotyrosine up here. And there is coupling of the mono and diiodotyrosines by thyroid peroxidase, TPO. Right? And then there are T4s and a little bit of T3 on this thyroglobulin. And they are then cleaved, and the T4 and T3 are excreted from the thyroid. So hopefully that all kind of makes sense. Did I leave anything out there, Elle? Anything you'd add to that?
No, that's
sort of
great.
summary
You showed that. Well, I would add this. So the two Hashimoto's antibodies, TPO, thyroid peroxidase, and thyroglobulin antibody, a lot of doctors only test one. They only test the TPO. It's important to test both. You can be positive for one and not the other. And being positive for the TG antibody, not the one you want. It's actually the more harmful situation to be in. It's the harder one to bring down. Usually you have to use LDN or things like that, low dose naltrexone. So you need to get tested for both. And again, this happened with the chick on the hike the other day. They had only tested her for TPO those years. Well, she's positive for the TG antibody. So what does that mean? Well, that means dietary, potentially like informing you about diet, AIP, autoimmune protocol, carnivore, or
autoimmune carnivore.
There you go. It is right. Carnivore is just naturally autoimmune program. And by the way, there are so many people that I've coached where carnivore is a lifesaver to them who have Hashimoto's, who have the double antibodies, and it is the only thing that keeps them well. And so now and again, and I know you would say this too, it's not everybody, but sometimes that's the move you have to make if you've gone this whole way like Paul did, and there's still lingering stuff. I have seen low-dose naltrexone bring down a TG antibody from like 8 to 4 within 1 month of only 1 milligram. So there are things to use out there that are safe and effective to help lower the antibodies. But yeah, it is really a state of inflammation. And then is that state of inflammation possibly affecting and causing and igniting a reverse T3? Maybe. I mean, any kind of threat like that could, when you are insulin resistant, you can absolutely go down that road. So, these obviously it's all connected. I think the most important thing is to get tested. Now, some people say, well, we don't do the ratio between the free T3 and the free T4 anymore. There are online calculators. You could just press reverse T3 calculator where you type in the free T3 and the reverse T3 and the units of measurement so that it does the calculation for you. Generally, it's considered that a ratio of 20 and higher is healthy. Now, if someone had a ratio of 17, that's not an alarm bell to go on T3 only, but it might be like, all right, try some selenium, try this, let's do some natural stuff, clean out the liver a little bit, whatever. And then it could go up, which absolutely have seen that. But if your ratio is like 11, it's brutal. It's a real state of serious hypothyroidism. And that's where I was. That was my reverse T3 in a range of 0 to 30 on my test. It was like 33 or something. And then my ratio was like 11. But again, if you had looked at some of the other factors, you wouldn't necessarily have been concerned or alerted to it had you not tested the reverse T3. And I also want to say this about a reverse T3 situation. If someone has to get out of it through medication, so you don't always have to. If you're a normal person, you're not taking thyroid hormone, it could be reducing stress, taking some adrenal support, other things, optimizing nutrition. But let's say you really can't get out of it naturally. Lost my thought here on this, but I wanted to mention something about, it's often dosed wrong by doctors. They don't know what to do with T3. And also it can take, now this again is a weird concept, but it can take like 8 to 12 weeks for that guard to stop standing and blocking. It can take about 8 to 12 weeks. So if you're taking T4, you're making your own. If you stop taking like Armor or T4 only, it'll probably get a lot out of your system in 10 days or so. But then it really takes a minute. It takes some time. And that happened to me. I noticed after I was on T3 only, probably at about 10 weeks is when I started to go, oh, things are really starting to change. I felt better in the brain already and everything else, but the whole symphony of everything happening in my body started to feel much better after about 10 weeks. And it's not like receptors clear and you wake up one day. And again, using receptors clear is just a way to imagine it. But it's not that you wake up one day and you're like, oh my God, my receptors are clear. Like, it's just that it can take a minute. So it almost sometimes can be a little bit of a longer process to get better versus someone who doesn't have a reverse T3 and starts thyroid medication, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And so just to pause, so people know if you have thyroid issues, they need to be getting TSH, free T3, free T4, total T3, total T4, reverse T3, anti-TPO, which is anti-thyroid peroxidase, anti-thyroid thyroid globulin antibodies to start. That's like a pretty, I would think of that as like a comprehensive, when I think of a thyroid panel, I want to see all of those things. In the case of Graves, which is hyperthyroidism, it's an autoimmune hyperthyroid condition, you're going to need there's other antibodies you can need to the thyroid receptor.
PSI is one of the tests?
Yeah, thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. So but if you don't have hyperthyroid, most people have hypothyroid, low thyroid, that's what you want. And Elle is giving us a really good metric here, which is that free T3 to reverse T3 ratio. And you said you want it to be?
It's 20 and higher is healthy, that ratio. Now, again, you can also look at the range. So if someone, usually the ratio will correspond with it. So if reverse T3 is lower in the range, you still might want to do a ratio just to double check it. But you can kind of almost know the person's got a problem if the reverse T3 is at the top and it's high, if it's past that mid-range of that result. Now, for example, so if you were to take my reverse T3 test today, it's going to be at the very low end of the range. And here is the problem with that. This is why T3 only is not ideal, okay? And that's why we always consider it the last resort choice, because you want reverse T3 working for you because it's a great emergency brake system that now I don't have because I'm a human body, human mind, deciding on what I need versus being in the flow of having that conversion and feedback loop, right? Where then you do want that to be there. So for example, let's say I got the flu tomorrow and I had a horrible fever or something, not corona, but let's just say I got a regular flu or something. I might, in my brain, go lessen my T3 dose for a few days while I'm going through that because I know that naturally would probably be happening in that environment. So you want it there. It's saving your life. It's helping you. It's just that sometimes when it's broken, you got to go to this ulterior, medication.
This alternative route. Yeah. And so let's break this down a little bit more for people here. This is pretty interesting. So
I also want to mention, we have to mention that, and this is for men too, but mostly for women. A comprehensive iron panel, including ferritin, is key in the labs that you just took because of this. If iron storage is low, and a doctor again will be like, oh, we tested your hemoglobin, no, iron storage. If it's really low, then patients have trouble raising their dose and getting to their optimal dose. And the best way that I can describe it for people, and you might have a more medical way of doing it, is iron storage is responsible for kind of getting those thyroid hormones to where they need to go. And so that's a lot of the trouble. So if you're missing that piece, I have seen that be the only piece somebody needs. In fact, having low iron and low ferritin and, menstruating females, this happens over time, especially if you've had heavy periods, you need to check into this. Sometimes it's the answer. Sometimes it's the only answer. What a dumb fix to take iron for 6 weeks. Like, Yes, who wouldn't want that? And so it's really important. Sometimes people have to take, like me, I had low ferritin back in the day when I was doing this, and I had trouble raising my dose, and I had to take iron alongside of my, not with it, because you take it away from it, but alongside every day to build up my iron, my ferritin, to the point where then finally the stuff was going to work right. So another thing too is that low ferritin symptoms, and this could also be adrenal, are when you lay down and like your heart is thumping and people feel like, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. Like you feel your heart in your chest. That's often low ferritin. I also had horrible restless legs. And this is, by the way, thyroid or not, if you got restless legs, check your ferritin. I mean, literally, I had a friend who had a perfect thyroid, but they had restless legs and tinnitus. Taking iron and getting their ferritin up did the job. And that was a dude who was healthy otherwise, perfect shape, ripped, everything else. I don't know how they got low in iron. They ate meat, they aren't bleeding, never had surgery. But again, it's a missing component that's important. So I always say, it, aside from this panel you just mentioned, and it's in my free thyroid guide on my website, it's all listed, you don't have to buy my book, is testing ferritin or iron comprehensive panel. Also, of course, vitamin D, B, homocysteine, some of that stuff, because it's all related and people don't realize what Bs they need. And then they go get some B complex and you're like, so ferritin is really essential. And sometimes the missing piece of the puzzle.
And I think that what's so interesting here is none of this exists in a vacuum. And most interesting for me as I've learned medicine and continue to research topics is the way that things are connected. So I think that at this point, we're starting to see some really interesting interconnections. We've talked about iodine, and I will talk later in this podcast about things that can impair iodine absorption. We talked about it in the first podcast, the brassica vegetables, goitrin, isothiocyanates. Many things can impair iodine absorption. But as Elle is suggesting, there are many other pieces of having a healthy thyroid. It's all interconnected, which is why it's so interesting to me that when we are eating animals nose to tail, we're getting all of these critical nutrients. Now, if we're talking about ferritin, ferritin is the storage form of iron. So I totally agree with you. If someone wants to understand what's going on with their body, most of the time I do all of these tests no matter what. I'm going to do a full thyroid panel, a full iron panel. I'm going to check homocysteine, and we can talk about what that means as well. And I'm going to check some other things because they're all connected. So the iron panel needs to have serum iron, TIBC, which is total iron binding capacity, ferritin. That's a good start.
And what about percentage of saturation? That's usually in an iron comprehensive anyway.
Yeah, the percent that your transferrin is saturated is important as well, and it gives you a sense
and
of
35%, kind of good, but sometimes you can have all these off. Sometimes people's iron labs. Oh, I also want to mention this. Sometimes, and the reason to get the iron comprehensive panel is when people are hypothyroid, they are often just inflamed, like, right? Just there's systemic inflammation going on, and or chronic, whatever, I forget, acute, whatever you want to call it. But there's inflammation going on. And sometimes when you're highly inflamed, the ferritin can be completely elevated, even if you're not taking iron and kind of masking that. That happened to me. So ferritin is usually like, let's say a range of 10 to 150. Mine was at like 150. And I knew that it was, I was like, that I was really inflamed at the time and also insulin resistant. And so I wasn't taking iron. And so then that's when, again, the iron comprehensive panel is important, but sometimes elevated ferritin is not too much iron. Oh, you have to donate blood. It's just kind of masking what might be truly there because you are so inflamed and it's raised, if that makes sense.
Yeah, ferritin is an acute phase reactant. So it's just further down the web. And you guys, I'm going to do a whole podcast on my blood work. I've done a lot of recent blood work. There's an old podcast. I can't wait for
that. What's your thyroid results? Are you willing to share them?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can share them during this podcast. I recently got them reexamined. They all look fine. But there's a connection between inflammation and ferritin as an acute phase reactant. And so what you need to know is an HSCRP. So if you want to check iron, you have to know HSCRP. So you just can't, this is the problem with Western medicine. And again, not all doctors are like this, but a lot of doctors don't understand that if you can't check an iron panel without checking an HSCRP. You also can't check an iron panel without checking a fasting insulin. And you can't check a thyroid panel without checking an iron panel. So none of these things make sense in a vacuum, just like you can't check a cholesterol panel without checking some of this other stuff, right? So you can't check a lipid panel. You can't check LDL or triglycerides or HDL until you know what somebody's fasting insulin is, or get some sense of all these other things. You can't check a lipid panel without checking a thyroid panel. So it's crazy to me when you go to a physician and they just check a CBC and a comprehensive metabolic panel. You have to check thyroid every time. You have to check iron every time. You have to check inflammation every time. You have to check some sense of metabolic dysfunction every single time, because it's a comprehensive, they all are connected. And as Elle is so clearly and I think so insightfully pointing out here, problems with the thyroid can be outside the thyroid. Problems with the thyroid can be your iron. And I just want to mention a couple things here. While we're talking about iron, my favorite way to do iron is spleen. So it's organs. And spleen is the most rich organ in heme iron. And so at Heart and Soil, we've got Blood Builder coming out, which actually has blood and spleen and liver. And that, in my opinion, is way better. We were talking before the podcast about the importance of, or the difference between naturally occurring quote unquote forms of vitamins and minerals and synthetic forms. We're going to talk about selenium in a moment and selenocysteine.
Can I touch on iron forms? Because over the years, there's so many different forms of iron. People will go get the Floridex liquid stuff from Germany. And
right, which isn't
by the way,
really that good.
Doesn't work, dudes. Or they're like, oh, I want to take some vegetarian. Actually, and this is just, again, thyroid patients over time, what we've learned is iron bisglycinate chelate is really the most absorbable form. It's the easiest. You don't get the old wise tale about iron constipating you are not true. That might be ferrous sulfate or some of the other forms. There's ferrous gluconate. There's all these different forms. I always say and suggest the chelated form, iron bisglycinate chelate. And so, and just as a warning to everyone, you have to take it away from the thyroid hormones because it could render them less useful. You can get into the depth on the binding of that, same with calcium and other things. But yeah, it's really, really important. And I just wanted to mention iron bisglycinate chelate, or ferrous bisglycinate chelate.
Yeah. And if you want to get it from organs, just eat spleen or beef organs, desiccated organs, like just eat liver or spleen or muscle meat. So heme iron is the form of iron found in animal foods. It's much more highly bioavailable than plant forms of iron. You are not going to be able to replete iron without heme iron. Now, I've done previous podcasts on this with Brian Sanders when we debunked James Wilkes on Joe Rogan and Chris Kresser and talked about all of the really shoddy science about the harm of heme iron. Heme iron is not harmful for people. In previous podcasts, I've talked about hemochromatosis, which is a very rare genetic condition in which people overly absorb iron. And if you have that condition, your iron saturation will be very high and you will need to donate blood. You will need to do phlebotomy. But generally speaking, most people will be just fine with robust amounts of heme iron found in animal foods. The other thing I want to mention about iron and ferritin is I've seen many times in people that they have a ferritin deficiency. They have an iron deficiency anemia or just frank iron deficiency, and it doesn't correct with iron supplementation. Further down the web, you must have riboflavin, which is vitamin B2, which we will see again here in a moment, in order to absorb iron properly. So if you have an iron deficiency anemia that is not correcting with iron supplementation, you need riboflavin. Where do humans get riboflavin in their diet? They only really get it in significant amounts from liver and heart. You need to eat the organs, which is, again, one of the reasons that I think getting organs is so important and why we do what we do at Heart and Soil to give people desiccated organs if they can't get it normally. So you got to have riboflavin. It all works so well together, you guys, but you can't have one piece missing. And that's what's so interesting to me about eating nose to tail is that when you do that, you're going to get all these things. You're going to get heme iron. You're going to get riboflavin from heart and liver. And all these things are going to work well. And you're also, if you pull out the toxic brassica vegetables, or the whole podcast we did previously was titled How Broccoli is Destroying Your Thyroid. And of course, there's a little bit of hyperbole there. But the point is, there are things that are inhibiting the absorption of iodine. So let's talk a little bit about the deiodinase. I want to mention
this is, let's say you're hypothyroid. And so there are people that are hypothyroid, and even let's say carnivore, and they're eating all of these things. Depending, if that's not solving their thyroid problem, which sometimes it does, but if it's not, then you run into a problem there because it doesn't almost matter how much meat you eat. Like when I was hypothyroid and had really low ferritin, I was craving chicken liver constantly. I was craving all of these things, which was a clear sign, and then when I finally got tested, the problem is that it's like, if it's not iron that's going to fix the problem, then you have to raise the thyroid so that so that you can hold on to it. This is why hypo patients don't have, they're like, but I eat meat all the time and I cook out of an iron skillet. And you're like, yeah, but you're still hypothyroid. So it's like taking 2 steps forward and 5 steps backwards. So sometimes, again, you have to combine these things with thyroid hormone replacement. And then once you get unhypothyroid, like I am right now, my body holds on to iron. I don't need to take it. Usually only need to take it temporarily to raise it up as you're getting the thyroid fix, and then you're good to go. You know what I mean? And then you kind of don't need to take iron. And just as a baseline, on a ferritin test, if the ranges are different with all labs, but if the range is, let's say, 10 to 150, ideal might be around 65 for a thyroid patient. But when you get down to 30, or you get down to the bottom of range, that's where restless legs come in. That's where you're passing out. And also you have brain fog. It also affects, and it might be TMI, but it's medical. It affected like the strength of my orgasms. And I noticed some gynecological stuff happening when I had really low ferritin at the time. And so again, this might just be a quick fix for anyone out there that's feeling this stuff that's not even hypothyroid. But you really need to get those levels up. So if the range is 10 to 150 and you're at 30, the doctor's going to be like, it's fine. And it's not optimal.
It's not optimal. And, you know, I see the ferritin range being much broader than that. People always ask me, how high should it be? I'll let people go to 250 or 300 before I'll even start to think about phlebotomy and anything.
Wow.
Yeah. I think it's totally fine. A lot of times on carnivores who are eating liver and spleen, we'll see ferritin go above 200. It kind of plateaus there. So that's 65.
And you don't see that as any kind of dangerous scenario at that point because you're looking at the factor that they are a strict carnivore in the absence of other.
Yeah, I mean, you can do things like lipid peroxides and 8-hydroxy 2-deoxyguanosine to look at DNA damage, and there's no real evidence of oxidative stress with that amount of iron. I mean, your body can store it. That's what ferritin is for. So I think that there's all of the reference ranges are based on the population. And if the population is shifted toward low iron, which most of our population is, it's going to look low. Just like the population is probably shifted toward low LDL because most people are eating too much linoleic acid. So the population ranges are skewed. You know, you're looking at the reference range, which is 2 standard deviations outside of the mean. But I think that indigenous populations who had access to red animal meat probably had higher ferritins, and I think it's pretty darn safe. I haven't seen any evidence that a ferritin above 200, between 200 to 300, is problematic. Now, some people will end up.
No, but also back in like old time days, if someone was like anemic and they didn't have any iron supplementation, it was like, go to the TP and die. See you later. Like, good luck. Like, we can't help you. You know,
or drink some of this blood.
Right. Exactly. I maybe I would have thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually appreciate, your comments on sexual health. I was just telling my friends the other day that all of the highest rated podcasts are about sex. So this podcast is going to be even more higher rated because we talked about orgasms. So fantastic.
Well, and it's true. Well, thyroid affects that. And everyone needs to know that because especially for women, it almost manifests itself gynecologically. So endometriosis, PCOS, like polyps, fibroids, all this stuff. Listen, I went through that many, many years ago. The worst thing in the world for a woman is to walk around and be in pain and be having like passing blood clot. Oh my God, this is this is horrible. It's horrifying. And in my book, I talk about the story. And I remember the editor said, is this TMI? And I said, it has to be said. I had such bad bleeding and, people were trying to patchwork it with the pill, right? We know, so they weren't getting to the root at the time. And I was hiking and I thought I had to like pass a bowel movement. And I was like, I got to go over to the woods. And I squatted, and I'm not kidding you, but several blood clots fell out of me. This is like the worst day of any woman's life. Okay. Like this is horrible. And so it affects your fertility. It's a main cause of infertility. And it's a main precursor, again, because the thyroid is responsible for the production and regulation of your sex hormones. I don't call it the master gland because I think it's so important. It just is. So if you've got issues with sexual function, which are related to hormones, do you need the progesterone? This happened with a young man who was about 25 years old and had reached out to me. He had low testosterone. The the mistake that the doctors made was they just replaced the testosterone without testing his thyroid, of course. So then we get his thyroid tested, is totally hypothyroid. So something like that, a patchwork operation will work for 3 months and then it ain't going to work. And so this kid didn't need testosterone. He needed to fix his thyroid. Brad Kearns is a great example of this. I've talked publicly about this with Brad Kearns a couple years ago, and he was kind of experimenting with keto and all sorts of stuff. His appetite was pretty suppressed, as it often is in keto people. And this is where you might have to watch it a little bit and make sure you're getting enough food. And then he was playing a lot of speed golf, which is one of his passions. And he kind of wasn't realizing that he was probably overdoing the exercise and not really the nutrition, and his testosterone went down. When he changed that, rested, laid off the stuff, made sure he was getting enough calories, testosterone shot right back up to high school levels. And he was like, he's 55 now, maybe 54. He was like 52 at the time. So again, that's why this needs to be tested first before you accept biological hormones regarding anything.
And I've seen that in my clients too. I had a client who was doing 1 meal a day as a 34-year-old male, and his testosterone went low. His total testosterone went into 300s. He started eating twice a day and kind of extending the eating window, getting more calories. And of course, what happens when you're hypocaloric? T4 gets shunted to reverse T3 instead of triiodothyronine. His testosterone went back up.
Starving.
900.
I want to make that point because the body thinks you're starving in that moment. And so it's going, I'm not going to give him any more of this fat burning T3. We're going to dial it back through the reverse T3 system, because your body's always trying to save you, always, at any given moment.
This is the problem with calorie restriction long-term as well. So calories in, calories out fails for long-term weight loss because of this. You can't starve yourself forever. The way that people need to lose weight is by correcting metabolic dysfunction, not by creating long-term massive calorie deficits. The problem I have with the calories in, calories out hypothesis is that the quality of the calories you put in your body affect the calories out. I still think that there is a caloric deficit that leads to weight loss for people, but you cannot put yourself in a starvation prison for the rest of your life. Your body will downregulate your metabolism through this lever of the thyroid gland. And so this is not the answer. Weight Watchers fails over and over and over because it's not affecting the quality of food. This is my main problem with people who are just advocating eat less, move more, and they're out there, is you have to affect the quality of the food. You have to increase the quality of the food. Everyone listening to this will know that I'm a huge fan of animal-based diets. I'm not dogmatic about plants, necessarily being completely gone. But if you've read my book, The Carnivore Code, if you've seen Heart and Soil, I'm a huge fan of eating nose to tail. And that's the key here, is getting higher quality of food and decreasing linoleic acid, which we're actually going to come to in a moment. But can we move on to talk about the deiodinases? Because I want to tell people about selenium too.
Yeah, let's do it.
So this is pretty cool. So you can see here my screenshot. This is essentially what we're talking about previously. You have thyroxine, T4. You can see the iodines at all four corners here. Of course, you guys, anybody watching on YouTube, I'm sure you will all comment about how many tabs I have open. Thank you. I think about a lot of things. I have a type 2 deiodinase, which goes to triiodothyronine, T3, and you actually have a type 3 deiodinase that goes to T2. We won't talk about that one today. And then you have a type 3 deiodinase, which can go to reverse T3 from T4. Now, the reason these are important, why are you telling us about deiodinases, Paul and Elle? Because these are dependent on selenium. So right now in this podcast, we've talked about iron, we've talked about riboflavin, we've talked about iodine, and now we're going to talk about selenium, yet another nutrient that is found in robust quantities in animal foods, and many people are deficient in. So why don't we unpack this a little bit for people, Elle, with the distinction between selenocysteine and selenomethionine. And you mentioned before the podcast that when you were diagnosed, you were deficient in selenium. I can't hear you anymore.
Sorry, I had already been on a T4, T3. I'm on T3 now, but once before I was on NDT, and then eventually failed me with a reverse T3 issue. While I was on that, I got a nutrient, mineral test done, and they were like, "Oh, you're deficient in selenium and CoQ10." And I was like, "Okay." And the doctor at the time probably gave me some of that, and I probably half-assed took it. So then it wasn't really till later when I got the reverse T3 problem, I was looking into this. I was like, is that one of the factors that edged me into reverse T3? Now there could have been a lot more, but that was one of the things, was really optimizing selenium. And so because it's responsible, or I would say that from conversion of T4 to T3, it kind of might've been part of that soup that led me into that reverse T3 problem and made that NDT backfire on me, so to speak.
And NDT is desiccated thyroid. So
yeah, natural desiccated thyroid. So Armour thyroid, Nature thyroid, iThyroid and IRFA in Canada, it's all kind of the same-ish. Yeah.
And this is ground up pig thyroid, right? It's porcine thyroid.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that's going to have naturally some mix of T4 and T3, but probably something comparable to the ratios we talked about previously.
It is.
A lot more T4 than T3. So again, we've had levothyroxine, which is the main thing that's prescribed to people today. It's all T4. The NDT, the natural desiccated thyroid, which is from a variety of sources, goes by a variety of names. There's a lot of literature on the web right now, guys, about purity, and this brand is changing. Armour,
yes.
Nature
and
Thyroid.
Stella recently had a big problem. One of the companies, they had so much T3 in their pills. So to avoid any of that, well, right now, Nature Thyroid and Armour are seemingly still okay. However, and I'm not sure about Canada and elsewhere, you could always bypass this. And listen, lots of people for religious reasons that don't want to ingest pork or anything having to do with that, you just do a T4, T3 combo. You can do it Synthroid Cytomel, those are name brands, but whatever, levothyroxine, liothyronine sodium, or you can also do it in compounded thyroid, which eliminates some of those fillers. So there's lots of way. Now, ultimately, a T4, T3 combo is really works for most people. It's rare that a person on a T4, T3 combo has to add T4 to it or has to add T3 to it. Usually people do just great. And as far as those ratios, so for example, in 1 grain or 60 milligrams of an NDT pill is 38 micrograms of T4 and about 9 micrograms of T3.
So it's again, that T4 to T3 ratio. Now, an important thing to realize about selenium is that most supplements are selenomethionine, but selenium in natural foods, again, let's talk liver, let's talk animal foods, right? Nose to tail for the win here, you guys. Get these organs in. That's selenocysteine. And again, there's only one supplement that I'm aware of. We talked about this, the one from Life Extension, that's selenocysteine. I'm always a fan of getting real food organs. So I think you get it from the real food, get it from organs, but you want selenium in your food. You can try and get it from Brazil nuts, but the problem with Brazil nuts is there's going to be oxalates and phytates in there that are going to impair the absorption of the mineral. I talk about that in my book, that a lot of the plant sources of minerals, whether it's magnesium, whether it's zinc, there's a whole study about oysters and impairment in zinc absorption with oysters in my book, the Carnivore Code, you guys. But it's the same thing with selenium. If you're trying to get selenium from plants, good luck, because it's kind of like the plant form of iron. You're not going to absorb it really well. And the plant form of selenium in Brazil nuts is going to be chelated by phytic acid. That's how it is. So probably not the best way to get it. Get it from animal foods, but make sure you get a quote bioidentical form of selenium. And the majority of what's out there is selenomethionine, which is not the best form of selenium. So okay, so do you want to go into a little bit about, actually, before we move into that, I want to talk about this interesting paper that I just found as we were talking. And, you've mentioned this a few times, and I have really thought about metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance a whole lot recently. But just thinking briefly about this, and just Googling quickly, I love that we talked about this. So I'll show this paper. So the T3 to reverse T3 ratio is associated with insulin resistance, independent of TSH, independent of thyroid stimulating hormone. And we'll put a link to this in the show notes. All of the show notes are at Heart and Soil Supplements, guys, for every episode. But what's so interesting here is that those who had more insulin resistance, which I think is actually a very bad term, and I'll tell you guys why in a moment, those who had more insulin resistance had a lower T3 to reverse T3 ratio. That is, they had a higher amount to reverse T3.
Right, the lower ratio, the problematic, right?
Right. So the ratio, it's a problematic thing because you have a higher denominator or higher reverse T3. So it's really interesting to see all the links connect here, which is what I meant when I said you can't check thyroid without checking insulin sensitivity. And there are a couple of ways to do that. The reason I don't like the term insulin resistance is because, as you guys will hear in an upcoming podcast with Brad Marshall, in which we talk about insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction at the level of the mitochondria, some insulin resistance is normal. Some insulin resistance is physiologic. That is how our body works to turn off caloric and energy substrate ingress into cells. There is a pathological condition in which there is overwhelming systemic refusal of many of the cells of our body to respond to the signals of insulin, and that is what we call metabolic dysfunction, and that is pathologic insulin resistance. But the reason some degree of insulin resistance happens to all of us at all meals all the time, and if you are on a ketogenic diet, guess what? The muscle cells in your body are insulin resistant. I just blew your brain. Wait for the podcast with Ben Beekman, which will be coming soon. That is normal. If you are starving, if you are not eating carbohydrates, it is within your body's best physiologic interest to have your muscle cells be physiologically insulin resistant, because that spares glucose for the tissues of the body, the brain, the kidney, the testicles, the ovaries, and the red blood cells that need that glucose. So to just say insulin resistance is a very confusing term. But what we find, this article should be titled Metabolic Dysfunction is associated with an increased, reverse T3 or a lower T3 to reverse T3 ratio. And I think what's fascinating here is that when someone has metabolic dysfunction, the cells of their thyroid are not going to respond to insulin either. And the cells of the periphery, just places in the periphery where those deiodinases may be working, right? Insulin certainly has a role here. I imagine that insulin has a signaling role in converting T4 to reverse T3 versus T3. And if those things are not properly signaled, if the cells are not seeing that signal properly, that is going to get thrown off. So if you are getting a thyroid panel and someone is not checking insulin resistance markers, they're missing part of the picture, which is why traditional ideas of balkanized or siloed medical specialties don't work, because which endocrinologist checking your thyroid is also going to check your lipids and your fasting insulin and your iron panel? No one's going to do that because it's turf wars. But you must know, and I suspect that for a lot of people, if you guys have heard me talk recently, metabolic dysfunction is driven by overly distended adipocytes, and that is related to excess linoleic acid. Again, podcast with Brad Marshall will go into that in much more detail, and I'm actually going to get Peter from Hyperlipid on the show as well. But when we were talking, Elle, maybe now is a time just to go a few minutes back into your history and what happened to you, because you said that you had some degree of insulin resistance when you were diagnosed.
Well, I don't know when I was first diagnosed. What I do believe is that my labs looked more like euthyroid 6 syndrome, which is the starvation thing, because I was doing low fat, low carb, chronic cardio, all this junk. Okay. So that could have started a thyroid issue, and then it went from there. But the second bout, when I had the reverse T3 problem, and by the way, I still didn't know after the first bout, when I corrected with NDT, I was still doing the old paradigm. I still didn't know about primal paleo, and I still didn't know. So then I get to my reverse T3 problem. I solved it with T3, but now my body's still fat and inflamed. That's when I was pre-diabetic. I had an HbA1c of 5.7. Now, I want to talk about a couple scenarios here that can happen. So, one, you could be a normal person in this world that has no thyroid problems, and then you get fat or you get towards type 2, you become pre-diabetic, unbeknownst to you, but you're following SAD, whatever it is, SAD diet, you do it, you get there, maybe you are a food addict, who knows? Either way, you get yourself there. So now that can cause a problem. Type 2 diabetes and thyroid go hand in hand. Or you could have the scenario where you're a person, maybe you've gained a little weight, your doctor puts you on T4, but you're still being mistreated. So now you're still hypothyroid. And then now that's going to happen where you might have a reverse T3 issue. Do you see where I'm going there? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it can happen kind of from both ends. You can edge towards type 2 and get a thyroid problem, or you can already have a thyroid problem, not totally corrected, or corrected, but you're not still on the right dietary paradigm because you think the hormones are all you need, but they're not going to get metabolized properly, as we have seen throughout this episode. So that's the whole reason I wrote the Paleo Thyroid Solution. It's not enough to take hormones, and it's not enough that your body's pumping out the right amount. Are they converting, and are they getting to where they need to go based on all of these things we just talked about?
So it's really a systemic issue. It's a web. We can't, and this is the reason that both of us do what we do. The mainstream medical paradigm misses the boat here. They're just going to focus on a symptom and treat a symptom. If you have a thyroid problem, they're going to give you a thyroid replacement. They're not going to think about what's causing the thyroid problem. And there are so many things we've talked about in this podcast that could be causing the thyroid problem. And until you correct those, you will not get to the root and you will not become a well human. And like you're saying, you could have underlying metabolic dysfunction, in my opinion, from excess linoleic acid, causing the adipocytes to overexpand. And if you don't correct that, you're never going to get well. Everything else is going to continue to cause problems. Everything else is going to continue to break down gradually as that progresses. And so this is why we have to think about it from a systems perspective. And I think the thyroid is a great entry point for all of this. And it's a window into all of it, but we can't ignore that it's all connected. And my goodness, I mean, how many doctors just don't understand this?
It's literally the story of my daily life. It's on, by the way, it's all over the world. It's no different in Brazil and Saudi Arabia. I see the same thing happening. It's like clockwork. It's almost just, I almost could do it blindfolded. I mean, because it's the same story every time.
It's so sad, but hopefully that's why I think podcasts like this are valuable. One more study.
That's why functional medicine doctors and functional medicine is important. And that's where I tell people that you're going to find the most knowledgeable doctors. Now, not all of them are created equal. I have been on panels with functional medicine doctors right next to me saying some really stupid shiz about the TSH or something. But at the end of the day, that's going to be probably the best bet. Like anti-aging medicine doctors, orthomolecular medicine, right? Functional. These are the people that are going to take the time with you to look at the whole damn thing. And that's why, touching on what you said earlier, you have to, because it can't be isolated with just take this hormone and see you later. And I want to also mention another thing, and this might have been on the last podcast, but I was at FitCon last year speaking, and someone raised their hand in the audience, and they said, hey, and this happened to Mark Sisson too. They said, hey, I feel great. I'm fine. I have no thyroid problems. I went to go, I do intermittent fasting. I went to go work out in the morning, fasted. And then I went to go get my blood taken and my TSH was like 3.5. And the doctor immediately prescribed him Synthroid. And the same thing happened to Mark. He did the same thing. He woke up fasted. He went for the blood results and the doctor only does the TSH. And this was at the time I was writing my book. So I was like, I can't believe. And so the doctor was like, I'm worried about your thyroid, Mark. And Mark was like, what? Mark was like, I don't have one symptom. I feel great. I got incredible fat burning because they didn't test his free T3 and free T4. The TSH is just a snapshot of, right? So at that time that the blood was taken, Mark had just worked out, he's fasted. That might be the time when the signal was sent like, hey, this guy needs some T3. So the signal's a little bit higher, which why it's a terrible solo marker.
And it's interesting that you're mentioning that it can fluctuate.
It totally can. And that's why it's just a snapshot. So it's not important because at that time of the blood draw, Mark's pituitary was sending the signal because he just worked out. Maybe the body needs T3. Sometimes exercise demands T3 in a way. So when you are on T3 only or these medications, it's important to sort of exercise. But sometimes I've noticed if I'm doing some hardcore stuff or I've gone like hours, I'm more intuitive about it now, but I might take a little bit more T3 that day. I can kind of sense if I need a little bit more. So again, this is where that TSH is such a problem. And so happened to Brad, happened to Mark, happened to this guy in the audience. The guy just said, you have a thyroid problem based on this TSH and gave him Synthroid. That is just wrong. That's
like guys getting testosterone replacement when they have a low testosterone without everything else being checked.
Same thing. And I always tell people, if you've got hormonal imbalances and you've tested hormone, you're low this, you're low that, get this tested first, correct this. The symphony and the conductor of all things will get back to normal. I once had low testosterone when I was in my early 30s, which is dumb. And again, I corrected the thyroid, the testosterone went right back up to the top of the range. Like, same thing with lipid panels. So now, you go in there again, like you said, they can't be isolated because if you've got terrible cholesterol or it looks bad to an uninformed doctor or even to an informed doctor, right. If you're not testing the thyroid, well, that person doesn't have enough T3 to be burning that fat that's coming into their body. So of course their lipid panel is going to look weird or wonky. Mine did too back then until I got on the NDT at that first time. Then it went back to normal. And the other thing you said about the CBC is really important. At a time where I was pre-diabetic, totally inflamed, knew something was up, but hadn't met Dr. Forsman yet, my functional doctor, I got a CBC and a standard lipid panel from a doctor. And they were like, everything looks great. You're doing awesome. Turns out I was on the edge of a stroke or a heart attack. I had incredibly high fibrinogen levels. My homocysteine was like 20 and the top of the range was 10. I mean, it was just like a mess. Now, I completely changed all of those markers in just a couple of months. But had I not known, had I not gone to a functional doctor who took all these markers, I might be dead by now. I might have been dead by a blood clot at this point. And one of the genetic markers, and I forget what it is, you might know it, but Dr. Forsman was like, oh, well, this kind of already shows you're a thick-blooded person. So the fact that you have this extra fibrinogen, and, I had thicky blood like a diabetic, the phlebotomist could barely get it out, had to stop and be like, I can't take any more blood.
That's not good.
Now my blood just flows and it's all good. But again, that CBC with that standard lipid panel, you're great. No, I wasn't great. I was about to freaking die at the age of 42. Like, what? You know what I'm saying? So I left my functional doctor's office bawling my eyes out because I was just like, again, like, thank God someone tested this stuff so that we know what to do about it. And I had that MTHFR gene mutation, and I wasn't aware that I had to get that fixed. So again, this is just why they can't be isolated and why one problem is usually an effect of the other problem.
Yeah. And they're all connected. So we can talk about all that as well. One more article I found to drive home the connections between insulin resistance or insulin signaling and thyroid. So this is a mouse model, but it shows that thyroid hormone potentiates insulin signaling and attenuates hyperglycemia and insulin resistance in a mouse model of type 2 diabetes. Most of the mouse models of type 2 diabetes are these DB mice, which have a non-functioning leptin system, but it's how they essentially model diabetes in mice. But you can see that when people were hypothyroid, and when these mouse models were hypothyroid and they included more T3, it potentiated insulin signaling, improved insulin sensitivity, increased insulin synthesis, which may contribute to anti-diabetic effects. So it's a little bit like Elle said earlier. It's hard to say chicken or the egg. I think it probably goes both ways in most of those situations. But if you don't have enough T3, if too much of that is going to reverse T3, your body is going to be more insulin resistant, and that is not a good thing. And I suspect the reverse may also be true, that if you are metabolically dysfunctional because of overly distended adipocytes, mostly due to excess linoleic acid keeping the door to those adipocytes growing, that you are going to have problems as well. So lots of things to connect there. I want to touch back on something that we mentioned earlier, which is the connection between low ferritin and restless legs. This is a little bit off the topic, but just so you guys all know, the synthesis of dopamine in the brain is iron dependent. So if you don't have enough iron, which might be indicated by a low ferritin, then dopamine is going to be low. And the way that we treat restless legs within mainstream Western medicine is with dopaminergic agonists, meaning medications that mimic the actions of dopamine in the brain. This isn't the solution. The solution is to give people back enough iron or figure out why there's not enough dopamine being made, but low iron can lead to inadequate dopamine formation in the brain because that is an iron-dependent reaction. Now, again, why do people get low on iron? My suspicion is because they either have something that is preventing its absorption or they're not eating enough animal foods. But that was an important point to sort of circle back on.
Right.
The other point that I'll mention is we've talked about homocysteine a couple of times. And I have done a podcast on MTHFR with Ben Lynch. You guys can go to the heartandsoilsupplements.com website and just go to the podcast tab and search Ben Lynch or search MTHFR. That's the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase enzyme. That enzyme converts homocysteine to methionine. It needs L-methylfolate to do that. And so MTHFR makes L-methylfolate, and L-methylfolate is involved in that conversion. And so if there's a problem there, then you're not going to convert homocysteine to methionine properly. And the other thing about MTHFR is it is also dependent on riboflavin. So back is our friend riboflavin, which is really rare in the human diet. It's really only found when we are eating nose to tail animal foods. So Elle mentioned that
so elegant that it's all right there in one animal. I mean, it's just this is our history. End of story. This is a story of us.
Sometimes I don't even understand how people debate it, but I suppose that healthy discussion is always good. But I have trouble understanding the way that people think a plant-based diet could be in any way evolutionarily consistent or sustainable. Or
that's why I won't entertain any arguments on that. But hey, if it's your choice and you want to do it, I'm cool with that. Just don't proselytize that we were designed. because it's not true. It's not. I'm
It
sorry.
doesn't make sense to me
there's no
either.
scientific. And I want to back to the bees on this. It's a story I tell sometimes. I don't belong to the gym now because of all the stuff that's happening, but I used to swim next to this vegan, and she one time had a talk with me in the locker room where she made me feel really bad about killing animals and eating meat. And I didn't get into it with her, but I was just like, all right, whatever. Anyway, I'm in the sauna. This is like weeks later, I'm in the sauna, and she comes into the sauna and she is like, I can't catch my breath. I don't know what's going on. I swim all the time. I feel I can't do a lap and I can't catch my breath. And I go, you're a vegan, right? She goes, yeah. And I go, when's the last time you had B12? When's the last time you had B vitamins? And she goes, oh my God. Turns out she had left that out of her life for a while. Not surprised she was having trouble breathing. Told her what to do, told her what to get, because I knew she wasn't going to quit being a vegan. And then she came back when I saw her a couple weeks later. She was like, oh my God, thank you so much. I feel so much better. You have no ideas. So why does she have to take that? Because it's an animal foods and we need it. So if you're going to be a vegan based on your choice, that's your choice. That's cool. But then you need to do everything you need to optimize it. And frankly, in my experience, I have seen it where I have never seen a vegan last longer than 17 years.
17 years is a long time, but
it's a long time, but those are the ones that were doing it like as good as they could. And it still failed them. So, and then I've seen lots of other fails with it too. And again, not even judging it. If that's your choice, that's cool. Just don't make it an ethical thing, because that's wrong. Don't make it about the environment, and don't tell me that we are inherently meant to be plant-based individuals. That's just not true. And so if you're going to make that choice, that's cool. I have no problem with that, but you're going to need to make some adjustments if you're going to live that way. I don't suggest it, but again, it's a choice.
oh man, you're going to have to make a lot of adjustments.
Yeah. Well, that's the truth. But again, just don't tell me it's a choice based on ethics or based on, it's really interesting to pull ourselves above this prey, this food chain. It's so elitist. I was talking with Rob Wolf about this. It's so elitist to say that everybody can live on plant foods. Really? So you're going to talk to that family living in the middle of the Andes mountain and tell where there's no vegetables whatsoever, and you can tell them to go vegan? That's such a first world elitist position. It's not possible, and it's not DNA mimicry as humans. We are meant to consume animals, period.
And I think when you reverse engineer it and you look at these nutrients, that's very clear. That became clear to me when I was writing my book, that if you reverse engineer where humans are supposed to get their nutrients from, we're absolutely supposed to be getting them from animals. That's the easiest way to do it. It's very hard to get it from plants. I just got back from Montana. I was climbing mountains there. Again, it was an alpine environment, but there was absolutely nothing to eat. I just kept looking around and kind of joking with my friends there who are from hardened soil and just saying, like, there is nothing here to eat except that deer over there. That's the only thing we're eating for dinner. And we weren't hunting at the time, but if we're living off the land, that's the only thing that is to eat. There's really no food there. At lower elevations, we went hiking the next day to a place called Lava Lake. There were a few huckleberries and a few thimbleberries. Maybe you could get 100 calories if you spent 4 hours, hammering thimbleberries. Yeah, that's about all you're going to get. I mean, and sure, that's great. And in my book, I talk about those as probably less toxic plant foods as fruit. But to imagine that humans got the majority of their nutrition, either from calorie or a micronutrient basis from plants, is, in my opinion, a real fairy tale. And it makes sense when you think about all these nutrients, whether it's heme iron, selenocysteine, riboflavin, et cetera. It really all comes together. I want to show this graphic. Again, this is the MTHFR enzyme. There's a whole podcast about this, you guys. If you want to see it, I go into more detail there. Here's methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. It takes this 5,10 methylene tetrahydrofolate and converts it to 5-methylfolate. And then 5-methylfolate goes through methionine synthase, which is a B12 dependent enzyme to convert homocysteine to methionine. B6 is involved in that conversion as well. And MTHFR has riboflavin as a cofactor. So here we are back to riboflavin. Yet again, you need that to be optimal. And really, the only places I've seen that are from animal foods, specifically meat and organs. So in Elle's case, it's interesting that your riboflavin, or at least your homocysteine, was super high. And it makes me think, what was your folate status and what was your riboflavin status? And then you can get that down. But that's, again.
And I did. And I totally did get it all down. And that's great. But these are the things most doctors aren't going to test. I mean, years ago, I asked a doctor when I didn't know too much, but I knew enough to, like, at the very beginning to be like, can you test my B12 or whatever? I had a doctor patronizingly laugh at me. He goes, please. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I like started crying. I was so upset and so emotional. And I started crying and I was like, I'm like, you're my doctor. I have a PPO. Will you just take the test? Well, guess what? My B12 was like 200. I mean, it's just always the case with these people. It's like, you don't need that. And then you're like, it turns out I'm totally screwed here. So it's hard, it's, these things all matter. So anyone poo-pooing or patronizing you based on asking for nutrient profiles, they're not the right doctor, or you need to go get tested on your own or look further.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. We talked about the deiodonases. There's yet another one that's important to mention here. Just so that we're fully talking about this, there's the iodothyronine deiodonase is the one we talked about, the DI 1, 2, and 3, DIO 1, 2, and 3. This one is selenium dependent, but here's iodotyrosine deiodonase, and this is dependent on flavine mononucleotide, which is a derivative of riboflavin. So
that's like the catchphrase of the day is
riboflavin. Riboflavin is my catchphrase on most days. So it's dependent on.
You said spleen. Where did you say was the best source?
Liver and heart is the main sources. Yeah, you can get some in kidney too, but it's much less in muscle meat. So most humans, I think, need 2 to 3 milligrams of riboflavin a day, and it's very hard to achieve that getting just muscle meat. It gets much easier if you include liver, and heart is not as good as liver, but still pretty good. But this iodotyrosine deiodonase works in the thyroid as well and scavenges iodine when it's in the gland. From these molecules. So in order for our body to properly utilize iodine or to move these iodine moieties around on, on thyroxine, triiodothyronine, or precursor molecules, we need both selenium, selenocysteine, and riboflavin. And I posted something on Twitter. I'll be reposting it on Instagram, I'm sure. And I said, unless you're eating liver and heart, you're probably deficient in riboflavin. Where do you get your riboflavin from? And someone commented, if that's the case, then 99.9% of people are deficient in riboflavin. And I said, that's my point exactly. In addition to many other things that most people are deficient in. So yep. I think at this point, we've given people a pretty good perspective on how the thyroid is synthesized, how thyroid hormone is synthesized, where it can go, where it goes wrong. I know you want to, let's get into dosing a little bit with just the caveat. You mentioned this a little earlier. A lot of this, you're going to need a practitioner to do this with, guys. Get somebody who is savvy. Don't adjust your thyroid hormone on your own until Elle is very experienced. She wrote the book on this. So if she says she's adjusting it on her own, take that with a grain of salt. We cannot give medical advice to you guys in good conscience and suggest that you adjust your own.
I never suggest anyone do it on their own because again, like I trusted myself at the time. I had nowhere to go. I wrote this book so you don't have to do it on your own and you can find the right person. And also it's where people really go wrong. I want to make, I don't know where you want to start with this, but I want to make a couple of points. So I'm not going to talk about T4 only dosing. That's usually once a day. It's pretty standard and it can work for people, but it often fails. So let me get into the T4, T3 combo. We're going to talk about the mistakes that doctors and patients make on this. I see this all the time and this is a major problem. So let's say someone needs to go on thyroid hormone replacement. You can't blast them with their quote optimal dose right away because you don't know what it is. You have to lead up to it because of the way T4 works in terms of, getting stored up and converting. So what does that mean? That means that when you first take your first T4, T3 combo, let's say it's, a grain of armor, then you need to get tested in 3 weeks because the blood tests are going to take another week. Now it's 4 weeks. You need to move up the ladder in a timely fashion to your optimal dose because you've introduced exogenous hormones. It's shutting down the feedback loop. And then what happens is if the doctor gives you an entry-level dose and says, come back in 6 months, in a couple of months, the person's like, I feel even worse. I feel even hypo symptoms I never even had before. And this stuff doesn't work and I'm throwing it away. That is because it was done incorrectly. So you have to get up to, and doctors don't like that. They don't want you to come back every 3 weeks, but you can fix this thing and get optimized on your right dose within just 2 to 3, 4 months max, feeling better all the way up to it. But on a T4, T3 combo, you can even do it 2 weeks is enough time to see if the T4 is doing its job and where it's at, but to just make it nice for all of the other docs and people out there. So do that. You got to get tested at 3 weeks. And when you go in for those tests, it's a morning blood draw and you never take your thyroid hormones before that. That's less applicable to people on T4 only, but if you're taking anything with T3 in it, it's going to peak and dissipate within a certain period of time. You're going to get a false test that's going to be not like, oh, things look good. It's because you just swallowed that stuff in 2 hours, then you got the blood draw. We want to see free T3, what's free and unbound and available, not what you just sent coursing through your veins because you swallowed it. So never let a doctor tell you to take your thyroid hormones before a test, and don't get tested at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after you've taken your morning dose. You go before 9:30 a.m., you shelve your dose. If you're not sure when you get to the lab, don't waste the blood draw, because it could be a false one if you don't remember whether you took your medication or not. This is like a constant thing I have to preach to people. And then you just take your dose after the needle is out of your arm. It's fine that it's a few hours later that day. That is going to get the most accurate results. Now, if you're like me and you want to geek out, you would take it and then get tested 2 hours later, see what things are doing, but that's not really necessary for most people. So that's another mistake people make. So you've got to go up in a timely manner. The other thing is that at least with natural desiccated thyroid, you really don't want to take more than 2 grains or 2 60 milligram pills in one dose. It's best for patients on T4, T3 to multi-dose, dose twice a day. Whether it's a 2-to-1 ratio or equal, it doesn't matter. But I've met people that are like, oh, I'm on 4 grains, I take it all in the morning. You're like, oh my God, no, you're not going to blast your whole body with all that T3 and T4. It just makes no sense, and it's not how our thyroid would work. It's not going to pump out everything in the morning. Now, sometimes people realize they need more morning and less in the afternoon, but these things need to be understood. So as a rule of thumb, you don't go above 2 grains in one dose. Multi-dosing is usually optimal, even if you take a grain in the morning and half a grain in the afternoon. And this is individual, and this is what you explore and find out along the way. So that's with T4, 3 dosing and the mistakes patients make. The mistakes with T3 only are astounding, because a doctor, even if a doctor's open to prescribing T3 only, which most of them aren't, sometimes they'll be like, here, take 50 micrograms. Oh my God, that would blast you and make you feel horrible. If you needed it, that's one thing, but still it's too aggressive. And so I think the conservative approach is always best. And one of the things that people do well on slow release T3, but I don't think it's optimal. When you're dosing T3, I'm a tailored dose strategy person. Sometimes people do an even dose. So let's say someone takes 10 micrograms of T3 4 times a day, 5-6 hours apart. That's one. T3 only patients usually need to dose 3 to 5 times a day on direct T3. It might be more of a pain in the butt, but you might need less in the afternoon and evening than you did in the morning, which is why a slow release thing that you take twice a day that's doing it over 8 hours might not be right for you, because then when you take direct T3, and I have this personal experience of it over so many years, after your dose, like, all right, that one was a little too, like, you can assess each dose and how you're feeling. And so you're able to like couture it in a way that's way better and more optimal than a doctor just going, okay, we'll do you on slow release T3, if that makes sense. And then you can also kind of assess with adrenals how that's going way better with direct T3. So with T3 dosing, and again, this is all entry, but if you're on nothing and you're T3 suffering, I'd start at like, talk to your doctor about like 5 micrograms in the morning, couple days later. See, you can increase your T3 way faster than you can T4 because of how direct and immediate it is. So let's say you start off with 5 micrograms in the morning. Great. Wait a couple days. Everything cool? Nothing crazy? All right. Then you might want to increase that to 10. Then you wait 5 days. Now what do? Do you add to the morning dose, or 5 hours later do 5? So now you're at 10 and 5, right? The way that I dose currently, and I've been on 100 micrograms, I've been on 50, the more metabolically efficient and fixed up I've gotten, the less I need. I have T3 efficiency now. I need less to function on. So I wake up in the morning, I take 10 micrograms of T3. About 5-6 hours later, I take 2.5, and then about 5-6 hours later, I take another 2.5. But I have also sometimes, depending on the month or depending on what's happening in my life, need 10, 5, 2.5. And I only know that because I've been intuitive. I've been on this long enough. But there needs to be a lot more tinkering with T3. And that's why it is a personal thing that you need to work with your doctor, because you can't just go in and get blood tests. And blood tests aren't as accurate on T3. You might have actually technically a higher free T3 in the morning if your last dose of T3 was 9 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night, and now it's dissipated. So these are things that doctors get real scared about, especially when you're on T3 only. There will be like really low T4, really low TSH, and the free T3 sometimes needs to be above the top of the range for people. Not always, but sometimes, and then a doctor freaks out, it's over the range, even though they don't have any hyper symptoms or anything else. So T3, I think the best is direct, and to 3 doses minimum a day. Sometimes people do better with 5. I initially dosed 5 days. If you have to be on 150 micrograms, you might need to dose. It also is kind of believed that it's almost like protein, where people say, oh, well, your body can only handle a amount of certain protein in an eating dose or something. It kind of, that whether that's true or not, it goes for T3. You don't really want to take more than 25 micrograms in a dose. So if you had to be on 50 or 75 a day, it would be a terrible idea to take it all in the morning. You want it to be an even spread to some degree. And that's individual. And this is something that takes tinkering, and it takes the trust of your doctor, because within the first month on T3, the ideal is you would ask a doctor, write me a prescription for 5 micrograms times 5 times a day. That's not how you're going to take it, but that's how the pharmacist has to dispense it. And then you start out. You may not get up to 20 micrograms a day. No one's saying you need to shoot for that, but it gives you enough where you can tinker with cutting that pill in half, because you're like, ooh, you know what? 7.5 in the morning. That's my jam. I can tell the difference between 2.5 microgram dose. I can absolutely tell the difference. So some people, again, can do well on a slow release T3. Then there's these other doctors out there. There's a famous clinic in LA where when people have reverse T3 systems, they ramp these people up on really high doses of T3 and they feel awful and their heart's pounding, and you can completely become hypermetabolic. The other mistake patients make is they know T3 is the fat burning hormone. So they start taking it. Their metabolism gets better. Their energy is better. So now they're like, I'll just take more. Wrong. We're Goldilocks. You're going to get hyper. Now you're going to get fat and bloated because of your appetite, because of the way cortisol is affected and glucose. That's not a winning game either. It really is minimum effective dose. And somewhere, does this make sense? And if I have to clarify, I will. But so those are the mistakes that people make with dosing. Okay. Now, what do labs look like? For people optimized on a T4, T3 combo, oftentimes, and again, you are not targeting a number. That is the wrong way to go about this. It could be too much for you. What one person needs in their T3 range may not be for you. So, but the average general of everyone that I see with labs and doctors too, is that people who are optimized on a T4, T3 combination usually have a free T3, at least middle range, if not above, some towards the top of the range a little bit. So let's say the middle of the range is 3.0. A patient would usually be maybe optimized 3.4, 3.5, 3.7. And that shouldn't worry anybody, even though your free T3 as a normal person in this world who doesn't take thyroid hormone would not get above that. And that might make you hypermetabolic. But what those doctors aren't understanding is that you are not factoring in the fact that we are replacing this, that we have shut down the feedback loops. Does that make sense? So what does it usually look like? The TSH often would be 0.01. Again, not targeting that, but that's usually what it looks like on someone optimized on NDT. The free T4, some max 1.4 in a range up to 1.7 or 1.8. If it gets above 1.4, that could be indicative of a reverse T3 problem and too much T4. But somewhere around 1.2 to 1.4, fine. And then the free T3, and we see this consistently. Now, that doesn't mean that someone's not, I've seen, there's a guy who has his thyroid removed. He's really optimized, physical health, metabolically just stellar, and doesn't even have a thyroid gland. He's on NDT, and he's okay with his free T3 at 2.9, which is a little bit below the mid-range of 3.1 on his labs, and he's fine because he's probably T3 efficient. He needs less to function, which makes sense why I now need less than I once did. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, but T3 only is a tricky game and you really need to learn about it. And I want to mention that one of the best books on this topic, it's literally like the only book just written on T3, is called Recovering with T3 by Paul Robinson out of England. He's a fellow patient. It's one of the only 2 thyroid books I recommend. He found out later, way later, that he had the genetic mutation where he doesn't have any of the D1, he always suffered on T4 only his entire life until he figured it out. And so that book was my Bible almost while I was dosing and trying to figure this out. So you don't want to overshoot it. You don't want to undershoot it. And so I talked to someone recently who was in Australia, because here's what happens. People think T3 is the energy hormone and the weight loss hormone. So then they take more, but then they're like, I'm really tired. I guess I need more T3. No, you're actually exhausted because now you're hyper. And this doesn't make sense to a lot of people. People think hyperthyroidism is like, you're hyper, you have energy. Dude, no, I was hyperthyroid before too on too much T3. It makes you exhausted. So that's where we don't go by just symptoms. You have to look at labs. You have to look at pulse. That's another thing you can do when you're doing your home diagnostics. I think a continuous heart rate monitor is really essential for people on T3 only, because I have been able over time to check, when I'm not feeling right, it doesn't happen much anymore, but if I'm not feeling right or something, I look at my resting pulse, and I know there's a lot of variables here. But if my resting pulse was too high, so for example, when I was hyperthyroid, I'd wake up and my resting pulse was 96. Holy what? No. And guess what? My temps were 99 in the afternoon every day. No, so these, and I was hot and sweaty and clammy, all that. Like, of course not. But I also became exhausted. You have an increased appetite, you're increased pooping. So it's hypermetabolic in a bad way. And it can also make you fat and inflamed. So it confuses people. So you don't just take more because you're like, I feel better. I'll just take more. I need to lose weight. I take more. Now you're going to roll over into the other problem and it's going to backfire on your ass. And now you're kind of back to square one. So I hope all that made sense. And if not, happy to clarify any of it.
Well, yeah, I think it makes sense. And there's a lot of individuality in there. I think
totally.
We spoke about this a little bit earlier. There are these different forms. There's NDT, there's natural desiccated thyroid, there's levothyroxine, which is pure T4. There's T3 only preparations. And Elle is talking about if you're taking NDT, sometimes you want to split your dose and start slowly and titrate and return and recheck TSH and number of things. It's a fine-tuning process. It's not simple. If you're taking T3 only, definitely do that with a healthcare provider. Do not do that on your own, and understand that that's probably going to need to be split and changed because you're bypassing that normal break from T4 to reverse T3.
That's why it's a pain in the butt. And if you can, and you're out there, then you would want to be on a T4 T3 combo because it's easy and it's endocrine mimicry and it's doing it for you. Oh, I can't hear you now. I can't hear you all of a sudden. I lost your audio. Can't hear you. I can't hear you. Oh, I see. Okay, I see what's happening there. Sorry. Oh, I did. I apologize, everyone. I think I screwed up here a little bit. And, Sorry, I'm unmuting you, but I can't. Yes. I pressed ask to unmute.
We got it. Okay.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We're double
okay.
zooming
I'm unmuted
here,
now. This is how it goes.
See what you were going to say. I didn't hear any of that.
Yeah, just that I was just saying you have to unmute me, but yeah, that there's lots of different regimens here. I think it might be interesting to look at my thyroid labs real quickly for people. I will do a whole podcast on this in the future, you guys. I did not get a reverse T3 because I'm pretty healthy at this point, and I'm paying for all these out of pocket. So my TSH 0.76, my T4 is 0.9, and my free T3 is 2.4. So
it's interesting. So a lot of people would say those are hypothyroid labs if they didn't know better that you have no symptoms.
Right. And interestingly, the TSH is super low. So the TSH is 0.76. They're all at the low end of the reference range. But what's so interesting for me, and we talked about this a little bit on the first podcast, is that
you're really low, but I wonder, and you did these in the morning, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Well, either you are just extremely, if you don't have any symptoms, you're good to go. But I mean, when you look at those labs, people would be very concerned that your T3 is at the bottom of the range, your T4 is nowhere near the standard 1.31, and your TSH is low. They would say you have euthyroid 6 syndrome likely.
Right. Except I'm pretty good.
You're thriving.
My brain seems to function well. Just so you guys know, my fasting insulin is less than 3 micro IU per ml. So I'll speak about this on a future podcast with Ben Beekman, but a fasting insulin is only a legitimate measure of insulin sensitivity if you're eating carbohydrates. Most people will know that I do include carbohydrates in my diet on most days now. In the past, and Elle and I talked about this on the last podcast, we spoke about changes to the thyroid hormone cascade on ketogenic diets. A lot of times what I see on people with ketogenic diets is a total T3 that is below the reference range, but a TSH that is within the reference range. So I do think that clinically, based on what I see, what I experience, and my clients, there is some degree of thyroid hormone sensitivity that is at play here as well. And I think that, again, there's something to be said for this. So mine look interesting, but my body temperature is normal. My metabolism is normal. I eat a lot of food. I include carbohydrates on many days now. I'm not always keto, although I do some time restricted feeding. So this is an interesting thing to consider as
It'd
well.
be interesting to get blood work on other carnivore people that have been carnivore for a while, who don't have thyroid problems, who aren't on thyroid hormones, to see what their labs are like. Because honestly, if I saw those labs and a patient sent to me, I'd be like, oh my God, this person is hating it. They're depressed. They're suffering. They've got right? Because that's the way those labs look. But now we're coming across this new paradigm of the carnivore diet. And again, it could be the efficiency of it, right?
Yeah,
or
if you have less of the foods.
Yeah.
You have less of the foods that are less of the plant compounds that are blocking.
You'd get put on Synthroid in 2 minutes if anyone saw those labs.
Maybe. I mean,
to
I don't know
a
how
Western
they
doctor. Yeah.
Euthyroid. Yeah. I mean, like you'd have to see a reverse T3 because my TSH is 0.76. So you're right though. People don't know how to read the labs. And while we're talking about those plant foods, I'll just show you guys a couple of articles that I have previously shown in the previous podcast that are quite valuable and good as references. This is concentrations of thiocyanate and goitrin in human plasma, their precursor concentrations in brassica vegetables, and associated potential risk of hypothyroidism. This is exactly what I talk about in the book, and the idea that there are many foods, things like, what is this food right here? Many foods, Russian kale, collards, Brussels sprouts, sufficient goitrin. These foods contain sufficient goitrin, which is an isothiocyanate, to potentially decrease iodine uptake in the thyroid, you guys. Like there is 194 micromole of goitrin in these foods. This is, radioiodine uptake to the thyroid is inhibited by 194 micromole of goitrin. So these are not the foods that are good for the human thyroid gland. These are not human foods. And then one more. This is a great review article. Again, we'll put them in the show notes at Heart and Soil. Various possible toxicants involved in thyroid dysfunction, a review. It talks about all the different ways that things can affect our thyroid negatively. There are all kinds of things. You can get excess dietary iodine, can do it. Naturally occurring goitrogens in legumes, plants, amiodarone, lithium, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, turnips, forms of the root cassava, soy or enriched foods. So these are the things I talk about.
Really bad one.
Many people would debate
birth control pills too.
Birth control pills, green tea, cyanogenic plant foods. So many things. Selenium deficiency, B12 deficiency. There's a lot here, you guys. And then environmental factors, isoflavones. Where are those found? Well, soy. And then things like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, bisphenol A, triclosan, which is probably everyone is full of that now amidst the coronavirus pandemic. Perchlorates in rocket fuel. Organic chlorine compounds and pesticides, cosmetics, UV filters meant to protect the skin from UV radiation can also alter thyroid homeostasis. A study on benzophenone too. That's a problem too. Heavy metals. I'll mention that in the beginning.
And I did have high mercury. I found out 2 years ago, and I've dropped it from 30 to 10, and I'm still going a little bit lower. But that obviously, as you know, affects mitochondrial function and possibly antagonist to the reverse T3 thing too.
Yeah. Bromine, so lots of things here. And it all kind of comes back to, if you have a thyroid issue, is your physician actually looking at those things and thinking about all that? So I think we've covered a lot. Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
No, this was good. This was a really great part 2, and I'm glad we got to do it. And I hope this really sheds light for things with people. And just go to my website, elleruss.com, click free thyroid guide. It has the list of tests plus the peripherals like vitamin, ferritin and stuff. How to maybe call up a doctor's office and try to assess if they know what they're talking about before you waste going in there and your copay. So it's free and it's there. You don't have to buy my book. I mean, feel free to, but at the end of the day, that's there for everybody.
And the book is the Paleo Thyroid Solution.
Yep, you can find it everywhere, and it's been awesome. I have to do a second edition at some point, I know, but for right now, it's just a great guide, and you can find that on Amazon or anywhere else.
Awesome. And what is the most radical thing you've done recently, Elle?
What is the most radical thing I've done? Oh my gosh, I don't know. We use the term rad here for like everything. So when you say radical, I'm like, does that mean crazy and out of the ordinary? Because we're using that term all the time. We're like, oh, that's so rad.
So rad. That's why I love California.
What was rad for me is that during this pandemic, I was able to discover some secret hiking trails that nobody knows about and that were like right down the street from my house. And so I've been doing all this really cool exploring and hiking, like at least minimum like 6 miles a day. And I tell you what, it's been been it's been so much fun for me. So I went on just like an exploration path. And I think the pandemic kind of forced me into that because I was like, well, let's find something new. And so that's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, you can tell us where they are.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not even telling some local friends. I'm like,
Secret trails. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. And
Thank you.
know this is going to be super valuable for people.
Thanks so much.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for listening to the episode with Elle Russ. Like I said, I really appreciate the work she is doing, and I think we were able to get a deep dive into thyroid. As I said in the podcast, I would not recommend messing with your thyroid dosing by yourself. Work with a practitioner who knows this. But the idea with these episodes is to empower all of you to understand that there is more out there than the mainstream. There is more out there than levothyroxine. There is more out there than T4. And a lot of people are not doing labs that are this comprehensive for their thyroid. So I'm super excited about the blood work stuff and really believe that understanding what your blood work is will be the way that a lot of us find optimal health because so many practitioners don't know this stuff yet. We have to educate the practitioners. At the Heart and Soil website, you will find that we are very soon developing an animal-based medicine referral network. If you don't get the newsletter, go to heartandsoilsupplements.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. We are at Heart and Soil Supplements on Instagram, but we are developing this animal-based medicine referral network that will have kind of another repository, an index of animal-based practitioners, people who understand the value of no-sustainable nutrition throughout the United States. And I'm so excited to be able to provide this resource to you all, and I hope it'll be valuable. That will be there soon. We will announce when it is happening. We will also announce when Firestarter is out and Gut and Digestion are out. They'll probably be out next week, you guys. And then Blood Builder will be probably the week after that. And then we've got all kinds of other supplements coming in the future. We're going to have 10 total in the next, probably by the end of this year or early next year, we'll have 10. So we're just adding new ones all the time as we can source them. And we are so proud of the unique formulas we're making. And we're so proud to be supporting regenerative agriculture and helping you all eat nose to tail. That's why it's called Heart and Soil. Heart, because it's my heart to be passionate to share this type of nutrition with you, to help you reclaim your ancestral birthright to radical health, and soil, because that is the future of our planet, and regenerative agriculture is the way to do that. Please check out my other sponsors. Please support them. TryLGC.com/CarnivoreMD, WhiteOakPastures.com. You can use the code CarnivoreMD at both of those spots for a discount. And you can use the code CarnivoreMD at NutriSense, maybe, or just tell them I sent you, or just go to NutriSense. Whatever you do, just go to NutriSense.io, get a CGM. If there is someone in your life that needs to make behavioral change, get them a CGM for Christmas, for their birthday, for whatever holiday happens in September, for Labor Day presents. Give them a Labor Day present, Labor Day present. No Labor Day presidents with a CGM. This will be super powerful behavioral change for them. And check out forceofnature.com. They are doing good work in the regenerative space as well. All right, that is all for me. I went to Montana last week and had an awesome podcast with Steve Ranella, climbed some mountains. I talked about that in the Heart and Soil newsletter. And this week has been a lot of catch up. I recorded a bunch of podcasts this week that are coming out soon. Did a bunch of research and lots of fun things in the works for me. I'm about to go get a workout outside in Texas on a warm day, but the sun will feel good. And then maybe be mellow for the rest of my Sunday and take a little break with some friends. But back at it. I recorded a lot of videos. Even last night, on Saturday night, I was recording a video because I'm so passionate about this. It never feels like work, and I'm so grateful for that because these are all things that I really believe in deeply, and I hope they are improving your life as well. So thanks for all of your support. Check us out, heartandsoilsupplements.com. Subscribe to the newsletter. Share our desiccated organs with people in your life who need more no-sustainable nutrition, and stay radical. I love you all.